Now, one of the cases that always comes up when you talk about UFOs is the Roswell incident. This is arguably the most famous UFO incident, at least in American history. And I'm talking about the events of the first week of July in 1947, where supposedly an alien saucer, flying saucer, crashed near Roswell, New Mexico, and the wreckage was discovered by a rancher. He showed it to some other people. Eventually the military got involved because Roswell was the location of a very important military unit that really handled, during the Second World War, our nuclear capabilities. So even though Roswell is located out in the middle of nowhere, it was an important site. And so you had trained professionals that allegedly found material, couldn't really classify it as anything they knew, and people were thinking that it was extraterrestrial. There were headlines in the Roswell Daily Record, other newspapers of the era picking up the story that the military had found a crashed flying saucer near Roswell, New Mexico. The story gets even more bizarre because, according to some reports, there were also bodies at the crash site of humanoid beings 3 feet tall or so, and you could see where naturally this would go. An actual incident, or again, so many people believe, of a crashed alien craft, proof of extraterrestrial life, proof of alien visitation. And so Roswell has sort of taken on a great deal of significance. It's kind of odd, though, that from the late 1940s all the way up through into the 1970s, nobody really talked about this. And the reason it was sort of reborn in the 70s was because Jesse Marcel, who was an officer in Roswell at the time and one of the people intimately related to the recovery of crash debris, came forward before he died and told the story about what had happened, the material that he had found, and so on and so forth. Now, what happened in real time was a few days after this made the papers, the Air Force, at the time the Army Air Force, denied that this was an extraterrestrial craft. Oh, we just mistook it for a weather balloon, and that was the end of the story until Marcel came forward again before his death and told quite a different story. Now, I personally don't think that any of this has anything to do with real aliens. I think that the Roswell event was what I would call an Operation Paperclip snafu, that something went wrong as part of the Operation Paperclip procedure program, and that resulted in the Roswell event. You say, well, what is Operation Paperclip? How do you reach that conclusion? What drives your own conclusion in that direction? Well, there are a lot of things that do that. The turning point for me as far as the Roswell case was really in 1997. Now, up until that time, I'd had an interest in UFOs. I was a reader in that area. I knew about the case. I knew the basics anyway, what was claimed to be found, who the particulars were. And I was in graduate school at the time, and I was listening during my evening job to the radio to a replay of the CNN press conference at Roswell, New Mexico for the 50th anniversary of the Roswell event. And it was during that press conference that the Air Force put forth their third explanation of the Roswell incident, which alone tells you something. Why do we need three of these? But there was a colonel there, Colonel Haynes, who was conducting the press conference, again offering the Air Force's latest report as to what had happened in New Mexico in July of 1947. And a reporter asked him and said, well, Colonel, by virtue of the record of the recent Air Force report, you mention in the report that the bodies can be accounted for by the use of crash test dummies by the Air Force, but your own record says that those dummies only came into use first in the early 1950s. So how can something that was started to be used in the 1950s be an explanation for this event in the 1947 incident? And when he asked that, I knew he was right, because again, I had read enough of the case to know that there was this disconnect with what the Air Force was saying about the crash test dummies. And I thought to myself, well, the colonel will probably answer this question like, oh, I misspoke. Here's what I really meant, a good question, that sort of thing. But he didn't do that. He actually stuck to the story. And he actually said, I went out and got the transcript afterwards because it was so unbelievable. He said, well, yes, sir, you're correct. We only began using crash test dummies in the early 1950s, but this is the explanation for this incident at Roswell. We think that all of the witnesses to the Roswell case have undergone time compression. And the reporter sort of had the same reaction I did when I heard it. Like, what in the world is that? And the colonel explained, well, we think that all of the witnesses that are recollecting something that they think happened in 1947, it actually happened in the early 1950s. And when I heard that, I thought, this is ridiculous, because there are newspaper accounts. You can go back and look. July 1947, this is when the incident happened. It didn't happen in the early 1950s. The answer was so absurd that the thought occurred to me that somewhere in the intelligence community, in the military community, whatever, someone somewhere wants this myth to live. And I wanted to know why. Because this answer was so patently ridiculous, and he was sticking to the story, that it just didn't make any sense. Nothing else made any sense, that the military actually wanted people to believe this narrative. They wanted to add to the conspiracy. They wanted to add to the mystery. They wanted this thing to live, this alien narrative. And I just wanted to know why. And what I came to was an answer wrapped up in something called Operation Paperclip.